You can go.
All right, are we live?
Yes.
Wonderful. So then I would like to warmly welcome everyone from the Innovate for Cities conference who's joined our side event for the launch of the Smart Cities Innovation Lab, which ESCAP has been launching and will continue to launch over the next month or so. It's a multi-stage launch. So what we're doing today is we're doing our first discussion publicly about what is really needed to scale up smart cities innovation for cities. Our focus is in Southeast Asia. And so we've brought together some experts from Southeast Asia working actively at different points of that smart cities innovation ecosystem to learn about what is it like to work in this space and where do we need to provide more support and how can we better shape our programming to accelerate the shift towards smart cities innovation. So my first speakers today are Pavina Adunratanasi, who is a serial entrepreneur, has been working in this space, specifically in smart mobility. And she's also an on-deck climate tech fellow, which she was together with me, which is a fellowship for those in the climate tech space. So it's wonderful to have you here today, Pavina.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. And then we also have Joris van Etten, who is managing the ASEAN Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund. So he has a enormous responsibility in terms of the financing for smart cities solutions, but also quite an interesting role in bridging those solutions from the supply side to the cities on the demand side. Or perhaps we see it more in reverse, sort of starting with that demand and then bringing them the adequate supply. So Pavina, can I start with you? Would you like to introduce yourself in your own words?
Absolutely. Thank you, Janet. Very excited to be here. Hi, everyone on the call. So my background is I've worked in utility scale renewables and the broader energy sector, first based out of Singapore, covering the broader Asia Pacific region for a wind turbine manufacturer. I have significant experience working in the energy sector in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and Myanmar. I recently, 2 years ago, decided to relocate to Australia, where I've been working in the broader renewable sector here, and most recently switched over to look at what are the different technologies that can be leveraged to unlock potential within the electric vehicle space in the Australian market. And today I'm really excited to be sharing some of that learnings that I've been collecting over the past 6 months of focusing on the broader global EV space and looking at how can we transfer some of that learning from the Australian and markets to the broader APAC markets.
Wonderful. And let me just ask you straight out of the bat, you've worked in renewable energy, you're working in mobility, how do you see which is the faster running horse at the moment in Southeast Asia?
That's a really good question. I think the past couple of decades was about decarbonizing the electricity sector, and we've seen a lot of disruption in terms of, if you look at the type of gigawatts of solar, utility scale solar that's been introduced in Vietnam, really under the recent feed-in tariff program that the Vietnamese government have launched. I think we see a similar potential happening in the broader transport sector within the various Southeast Asia markets. Although what we've found is that a lot of the transportation transition within the broader APAC markets and South Asia will be very much focused on two-wheelers and three-wheelers. There's still opportunities to introduce innovative technologies like battery swapping or looking at vehicle to home application. How can we help consumers and households use that storage potential within their EV to power their households, right? So that's going to be a really interesting concept, and ultimately working alongside utilities within these markets to design a solution that can effectively help them integrate EVs, all sorts of EVs, whether that be buses, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and passenger vehicles into the grid in an effective manner.
Well, I love that. So you're saying EVs are going fast, renewables have had a longer lead time, and now they're joining as we see vehicles as batteries, and seeing how vehicles can integrate into the grid as they increasingly go electric. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation about this in just a few minutes, as it's quite an exciting field. Okay, so you're working on that supply side, you're providing solutions. Now, do you see yourself as an enabler, I'd say, that sort of bridging role? Perhaps you can introduce yourself, and then we'll discuss a couple of things before we start on your presentation too.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. Much appreciated to invite us. So I'm Joris. I'm a senior urban development specialist with the Asian Development Bank. And of course, as a bank, with our shareholders being countries in the region as well as outside, our clients borrow resources from us to finance infrastructure projects, mainly. So in the urban sphere, you have to think then about mainly solid waste management, water supply, wastewater, of course, transport as well. And as an institution which provides financing, of course, we want to provide financing for projects which push the boundaries a little bit when it comes down to innovation. And when it comes down to particularly not only the construction of certain assets, but also the long-term maintenance and operation of those assets. So how can we use our resources to leverage innovation as well as leverage further private sector involvement? That's of course a key challenge for us. So we as ADB, to what extent are we an enabler? Yeah, we like to see ourselves in that way, of course, to bridge a gap between countries keen for solutions and potential suppliers of innovative ideas which are relevant within the setting of a developing country.
Yeah, amazing. And now I asked Pavina Energy Mobility, but you're dealing with so many more types of smart city solutions. Apart from energy and mobility, what kind of areas of smart city technology are you finding very exciting or fast growing or in demand at the moment?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting. So the trust that I work with is looking mainly on countries in the ASEAN context. And then, of course, if you look at, there's a huge diversity, yeah. We don't directly do work in Singapore or Brunei, but of course we have Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and then you also have countries such as Cambodia, Laos. So then the question is, of course, what is the smartest for these client countries and cities? And normally, when we think about smart cities, we think about very high tech, fancy solutions, which unfortunately, I think within the given context of a city in developing member country, we need to be very careful with that. There's too many solutions introduced to cities which they look great on paper, but then when it comes down to longer term maintenance of these solutions or the costs involved to maintain these, it's really very challenging. So smartest thing to do is basically you have to really look at what makes sense for that city. So one thing which, however, cuts across, whether it's very technologically advanced or not so, more basic, I think the key element, of course, always will remain data and the way people and we collect data, how we store these data, how we analyze these data, and then lastly, how we utilize these analyzed data to make better decisions for the future. So even in a very environment where basic services are still very rudimentary, again, collecting data on, current status of service levels and getting to know, your citizens best, to get to know their priorities, et cetera, et cetera. That's just extremely helpful. So we're mainly focusing with the Trust Fund on to what extent we can help with data, as I said, data collection, data management, data analysis, and then using those data to make better informed decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, data is the new gold. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thanks for that. I'm keen to learn more about how that trust fund operates, just those leverage points where you found really help, and some things that you've tried where you think that was quite an interesting lesson learned, to put it in that way. But we'll come back to you. So let's start with the presentations now. What I'd like to do is dive right into the solutions. So let's start with Pavina and your presentation on smart mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. I'm just going to get my screen started. You can see my screen, okay?
Yeah,
Yes.
looks great.
So today I'd really like to talk about leveraging on innovative technologies to unlock, to accelerate the adoption of EVs in emerging markets. So just to give you a bit of context, mobility alone accounts for 95% of dependency on oil globally, right? And 20% of global energy consumption, which is quite significant. And also it contributes to 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which means there's tremendous potential for us to unlock or decarbonize within the transportation sector. And the challenge that we're facing here is rolling out electric vehicles or electric mobility solution in itself is not going to necessarily solve the decarbonization problem, because a lot of the charging solution or charging times that EV drivers will rely on they're relying on generation from the grid, which in a lot of the Asia Pacific markets are very much generated from fossil power resources. So just to give you a bit of context around the market growth and the market size, right? EVs need to be around 60% of new sales by 2030 to stay on track for net zero emissions. And we're seeing a lot of growth, most of the growth driven within China and Europe, with a bit of pickup from within the passenger EV space from the US. However, I think other regions are really taking off, and we're seeing electric two-wheelers and three-wheelers really take off in the Southeast Asia and broader ASEAN markets. There are over 1 million commercial EVs, including buses, delivery vans, and trucks. And we're seeing already around 260 million scooters, electric mopeds, motorcycles, and three-wheelers in the broader global market. And now what we're going to see from a global adoption perspective is really that the two and three-wheeler segment is going to grow quite rapidly in the ASEAN markets. And what we're going to see as connected to that growth is essentially rolling out charging infrastructure to be able to support that EV growth. Ultimately, the uptake of EV is going to drive electricity demand. And I think according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they forecast that we're going to need an increased electricity of about 1,964 terawatt hour by 2040. So the challenge here is really we're going to see a lot of, once the uptake happen in the broader ASEAN region beyond 2030, as a function of cost of EVs coming down, cost of battery, lithium ion battery really coming down due to mass uptake of EV and increased supply chain. We're going to see a lot of EV charging happening during really that peak hour, right? And what I want to present today is like a study that was done with a recent startup in the UK that looked at testing out 1 million EV passenger EVs, and they've collected data. And here's some findings from the research. Most of the EV drivers plug in their EVs during peak hours, which means that 48% of them charge between 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., right? And this is really peak consumption. And what this does is it's during the peak congestions in the power grid, and this has led to EV charging adding peak load and increasing the need for grid upgrades. And what we can do, and if we look at kind of the global new car sales that is expected in Southeast Asia, we're looking around by 2035, the year 2035, around 60% of new car sales are going to be EVs. So that correlates very well with kind of the increase in electricity demand that is required to power these EVs. So really, we've kind of spent the past 6 months obsessed with this problem around, well, how do we really unlock that clean energy generation, right? To be able to power all these EVs that are going to come online within the next 10 years in the broader Asia Pacific market. And looking at kind of the learnings from developed markets like California, the UK, and to a lesser extent, Australia, where the EV uptake hasn't happened that fast, we found that these energy markets, there's a wholesale energy market, and it's quite a complex energy system to navigate, right? As a consumer, consumers end up really purchasing EV at peak hours of the day from the grid when essentially solar is not generating and there isn't a lot of renewables in the grid, and when electricity prices are more expensive. Within the APAC context, I think within the ASEAN markets, the concern will be, well, how can you shift EVs, whether that be three-wheelers or electric vans, from a last mile delivery perspective, to really charging their fleet when there's a lot of renewables in the grid, when you look relying on some of the gigawatts of solar that has been introduced in certain markets like Vietnam, or on-site generation through rooftop PVs. And the challenge we're looking at here is really the effective integration of EV into the grid. And modeling from EVs in the US showed that 25% of EV share in the system charged in an uncontrolled manner could increase peak demand by 19%, right? And that's a significant challenge for grid operators. And our view is that it will become an issue in markets like Southeast Asia, where although we're not seeing a huge uptake, it will become an issue in the next couple of years. So the opportunity we found here is really to be able to spread the load over the evening hours that could cut peak demand costs by 0 to 6%, right? So how do you do that? Essentially, you use a simple fleet management tool, which is a software that leverages on Internet of Things to be able to connect directly to charger, and what it's called is a smart charging solution. This platform can essentially enable smart charging and energy management for commercial and utilities that want to be able to effectively, and households that want to intelligently integrate their EVs into the grid. And this has been deployed in many markets, in many developed energy markets. What the opportunity of smart charging provides is really to be able to provide grid operators and network operators to limit the need for grid upgrades, right? And a lot of governments around the world are now, or utilities around the world are now mandating smart charging and exploring how can you implement bidirectional charging, which is two-way flows of electricity from the car EV, and how looking at that type of technology, but also how you can use charging of aggregated EV fleets that can be start and stop in an automated fashion, right? And a study from BNEF showed that 60% of charging in Germany in 2040 will be smart charging, which could ultimately reduce peak demand by about 7 gigawatt, which is really a significant statistic here that we're looking at. The biggest peak demand for charging EV could occur in the middle of the day when there's a lot of on-site solar, or there's a lot of solar in the grid in certain markets, and that really helps EVs and rely less on electricity powered by fossil fuels. And the other opportunity that we're also looking at is virtual power plant technology. That's really looking at integrating across a fleet of EVs, which is what the diagram that we have here, and using that energy to essentially supply energy back into the grid, whether that be through a vehicle to grid application or curtailing demand behind the meter, which essentially helps to improve grid balancing grid balancing opportunities. And there've been studies done in markets like California where EVs were actually used to respond in real time to turn down dispatches as directed by the market operator. And this has helped even reduce EV load demand by delivering up to 5 megawatt of flexible capacity during critical grid hours. So there's actually a lot of potential that behind the meter EV load can play in balancing the grid and in developed markets. And our thesis is that, well, is there opportunity to test how some of these smart charging technologies can be deployed in a vertically integrated energy market like in Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, where we're going to see a lot of uptake of EV. So how does the technology work? Just to jump right into it, it's essentially enabled by IoT, and it allows fleet operators to be able to locate their EV, retrieve their state of charge, and control charging with a simple API request that essentially connects their EV to the platform. It's an integrated solution that provides energy management capabilities and ultimately helps fleet owners reduce their OpEx. And this is very much applicable to developed markets where commercial and industrial operators are paying quite a large tariff fee to network operators. And what we found is that this type of technology can help reduce electricity bill by 20 to 30%. And our view is that there's opportunities to help commercial fleet operators in the ASEAN markets effectively manage their fleet. So how does smart charging work? Really, it allows you to be able to stack multiple value streams across the energy and fleet energy, across the energy and fleet management value chains, looking at different applications, really like vehicle to grid, which is being able to supply energy back into the grid, which is very much in the early stages of R&D, even in Europe and the US. And there's obviously bidirectional control, looking at leveraging that power that's within the EV storage to power your home or power your building. And the last feature is looking at adding in algorithms powered by artificial intelligence or machine learning to be able to essentially use that energy that's unlocked within the storage within the EV to provide services back, to provide energy back into the grid and trade in the electricity market, mostly applicable to markets, developed markets where there is a wholesale electricity market like California, Texas, the UK, and Australia. So the flexibility provided by EVs and other forms of behind the meter storage really has a huge potential to help the grid transition to a decentralized manner and more to integrate more renewables in an effective way. And the benefits ultimately is that these type of platforms allows EV drivers to be able to adapt their charging patterns to flatten peak demands, support real-time balancing of the grid. It also ultimately help them improve ROI in their asset and reduce the need, helps the grid reduce the need for investment in carbon-intensive fossil fuel, because it's essentially relying on renewables that are already existing in the grid or are on site at customer side. So the smart charging market size is really interesting. I mean, we're really looking at globally, if we look at where it really sits is the intelligent software market, right? Which is around a $30 billion market, and really across. It's also, if you look across, it sits within the broader charging infrastructure market, which is globally around a $200 billion market. And that covers vehicle to home and vehicle to grid type of technology as well. Our vision for the future is really smart charging is really a smaller piece of the broader software technology that can leverage on Internet of Things to be able to control charging infrastructure, right? And allow consumers to do more with their EVs and the batteries stored within their EV, which can power your home for up to 5 days. So that's quite remarkable. And I think the vision of the future is that these type of technologies can enable peer-to-peer trading, which is one household trading energy into another household, energy trading in the electricity market, looking at ultimately also changing behavior of how consumers use their electricity, so that instead of using during times when there are not a lot of renewables in the grid beyond at peak hours, they can shift to times during the day when there's a lot of solar in the grid. And this is really interesting. So these are the type of applications that we want to be able to introduce and test on how that applies to the broader ASEAN markets. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation.
Thank you so much, Kavina. I'll ask you to keep that slide up there because I have a few questions on what does this look like in for us everyday people living in cities and for urban planners. So you've mentioned the behavioral change. So I like the graph where you had the time of the day, and then there's different characteristics. Sometimes it's peak or off peak. Sometimes it's more renewable energy or less renewable energy. So my question, first of all, is when do your algorithms nudge people to plug in? Is it, or to charge, sorry, maybe plugged, but not charging. Is it when it's more excess renewable energy, or is it when it's off peak?
Yeah, that's a really good, Janet. I think the idea is to be able to use smart charge technology to be able to automate that process, right? In the first instance, the simple process is to nudge people to use electricity to charge not just their EV, but their smart devices within the household through a smart thermostat, to be able to control the smart devices during times when there's a lot of solar in the grid, right? Which is during these hours. And if they have on-site generation, it could be after where they could essentially use energy from their battery here to power up their EVs and their household, their smart devices within the household. But the concept of behavioral change is really quite interesting. It's really about, well, even with the simple washing machine or other forms of electrical appliances at home, right? There is behavioral shift that can already happen. And there are startups out there that are providing solutions to consumers to help them shift to times, use times when there's a lot of renewables in the grid. So that doesn't require a lot of automation, but what we're seeing already take place in a lot of markets like California and Australia is really about automating that entire process.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then back to the slide on the vision for the future. My other question is, when you start getting into a vehicle as a battery, you know, the vehicle is now, it has that expensive and heavy battery in it. So why not use it to sort of store a bit of energy, shift it around to a different area? But how do governments feel about that, particularly in Southeast Asia, when sometimes the electricity market is very, very regulated? Do you sometimes feel like you might be treading on some toes, or is there some sort of regulatory barrier to using vehicles as batteries?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Janet. In the first instance, the concern is probably around, I think we've seen a lot of auto manufacturers talk about concern around degradation of the battery. I think if you look at a Tesla, you're not able to look at vehicle to grid applications with a Tesla yet. But then if you look like at a Nissan Leaf, the Nissan Leaf is able to access vehicle to grid application and vehicle to home. So that's quite interesting. I think a lot of auto manufacturers are now moving towards being able to enable their batteries to be able to power up homes or buildings, and ultimately looking at vehicle to grid type of tests, right? But the challenge here is I think from a technology perspective, certainly there's been a lot of R&D that's been done. From a regulatory perspective, I think there hasn't been there hasn't been a lot of strides done, although in certain markets, like I said, in California and Australia, there are tests for vehicle-to-grid applications taking place. In our own research, we found that, well, Thailand is also looking at, well, what are the challenges that could happen with integrating EV into the grid? I think one of the biggest bottlenecks that we found in trying to scale this technology to broader ASEAN market is really being able to work alongside utilities, state-owned utilities, to be able to test this technology, probably in the first instance in a microgrid environment, to be able to test that the technology actually effectively works, and to make sure that this is something that is designed to fit the local context, because here we're not talking about, we're talking about the lack of existence of wholesale electricity markets, right? Although they've been talking about introducing wholesale electricity markets in Vietnam, and Philippines has an existence of the WESM, but it's really looking at, well, how can we create a market for distributed energy resource, which we are moving towards that globally. So I think to answer your question, I think it'll be very important to work alongside the right stakeholders, the regulators and energy utilities, to be able to effectively introduce these type of technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. What we have seen with a lot of solutions is that they may be addressing a lot of public policy goals, such as yours. You know, it's coming to the table with energy efficiency, managing peak electricity, and they're really integrating mobility, household energy, and the grid. So, but the sectoral policies may not be keeping pace with the solutions that are on the market. So from that sense, I'd like to now move to Joris to get his views on that sort of macro view of how we can support these solutions. So thank you, Pavina. We'll come back to you in the Q&A afterwards. But I want to start with asking you, Joris, is to what extent do you find that governments in Southeast Asia are trying to integrate smart cities policy goals, not just in one smart cities action plan or strategy or vertical or ministry, but is it starting to appear in other sectoral policy domains? Or are we still at early stages there?
Of course, there's a huge diversity in how smartness gets picked up by cities and by national governments. But I think, particularly given the COVID pandemic, there's a huge spike in appreciation and uptake. And you see that the cities which are moving, in this space a bit quicker than others, they really have they're really trying to make it work. And I think we really have to try and facilitate and encourage those who are pushing for innovation, because of course, particularly given the pandemic, we all know that service delivery to continue with less face-to-face interaction for cities who have limited budgets to prioritize these resources in the best possible way, just to make better plans which are more integrated. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. I feel also that there's an opportunity to move forward now, given that, of course, the technology is getting more and more relevant and ready. Yeah. So just to tell you a little bit about my the work we are doing through this ASEAN Australia Smart Cities Trust Fund. So what we're particularly interested, what we're particularly interested in is so we've seen shocks and stresses throughout our throughout history, whether it was the different medical health crises or financial crises, and each time when there is a crisis, there is also an innovation, which I think is of course quite every crisis provides great opportunities for innovation. But what we realize more and more is, of course, that there's no plan B. Yeah? So we are vulnerable, particularly our cities are vulnerable. And particularly in large cities where we all cram together, that, we can develop wonderful, fancy cities, but just a little, germ can indeed put us all to stop. So I think we are just becoming much more open to how vulnerable we are. And that then, of course, results into rethinking as to, what do we need to do in order to become more resilient? And then we often look at best practices. However, the storyline we want to tell is that the best practice is not sufficient. Best practice is based on retrospective of something which happened in the past, which worked well. No, there's a need for focus on next practice, particularly since the cities we build now, that they are going to be around for hundreds of years going ahead. So in the past, our best practices did not consider, for example, health crises or terror or climate change that much as we now are fully aware of. So we need to move to what we call then these best-centric, and human-centric practices, next practices. And that revolves around sustainability and livability, smartness, resilience, climate flexibility, cultural. So you can see here that smartness is not seen as a goal itself, but it's smartness as a tool to make cities more human-centric. And so what are then some of the elements you can look at is, building on the communication and technology which is out there, such as 5G, which will allow Internet of Things, of course, at a much larger scale. We've seen massive innovations around the topic of autonomous healthy mobility, economic transitions, whether you look at smart economy or transport, the topic we just talked about. So moving away from individual ownership to, for example, subscription of mobility services. Remote working, of course, is a very big topic for all of us involved. I think many of us are still working from home. So climate change is, of course, also a topic to take into consideration, whether it is on new ways of planning, incorporating resilient aspects of mobility. And then the Corona crisis also for us to transition into readiness in general, and the consequences of crowding. So living in these very compact cities, how many people will indeed go again into pushing themselves into a subway during peak hours. So what do we do then? What are we focused on building on that analysis? So we look at trying to support designing livable, integrated, inclusive habitats, and having those enabled by technologies and policies. So the trust fund I represent is a $20 million Aussie dollar trust fund for strategic city planning, service delivery, and financial management, with some further attention to some cross-cutting themes such as gender equality and social inclusion, climate change, and private sector involvement. And what we're looking for is to support the development of scalable best practices. Now, here say still best practices, but that should, of course, be next practices based on what I presented before. We do that in 26 cities at the moment in the ASEAN region, where there's different level of involvement. So bronze is regional capacity development exchanges, silver is where we really try to engage in a deeper level, and gold is where we focus on investments, where we actually build something concretely, and where we people can see and smell. Just to wrap up, a couple of examples. So the first one is in Makassar in Indonesia, where we look at providing the city a tool to assess and plan their city. And so not so much prepare a plan for them, but more or less provide them the key building blocks. So how do you collect data and store those? This is capturing here, for example, what you see here is capturing the data of citizens and opinions. And how do you then build that into your planning system? So we are not providing them a plan, but we build a way to prioritize some investment decisions. Another element we also did in Makassar was looking at particularly using spatial data to support better post-pandemic urban planning. So knowing all the data which have been collected as part of the pandemic, what does that then mean in terms of your future city? How it does look like? So how can we use data to complement City of Makassar planning processes? Another element we looked at was, which we feel is very, of course, particularly also important as part of COVID, and given that many students are online learning, is indeed the digital tools to help students reach the labor market in Lao PDR. So we provided, these are for vocational training, so students who are about to graduate from their vocational training and then move into factories and other businesses, and to help them learn some of the soft skills required to be in a business environment. And then lastly, we've had a datathon allowing for people to submit exciting new ideas to build back cities smarter. And so we have two winners there. One was Alloy Technologies, which helps micro entrepreneurs to have access to de-risk loans, so small loans. And then Alaga Health in the Philippines, which is a provider of telehealth services. So these were then the winners of our Datathon 2020 for building back smarter. So on that note, we're quite active on social media. So if people want to follow us there, that would be appreciated. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Joris. So you've mentioned that you're not only looking for and financing solutions to be rolled out in cities, but you're also supporting the broader infrastructure and the broader movement of smart cities through your datathons and training, etc. So I would like to follow up on this point. What do you think is key, instead of just providing money, matching that with the demand? What are the key elements that we need to do to support the movement of smart cities in Southeast Asia? Policy? Is it training? Is it providing opportunities for those at the early stages, or something else?
Yeah, so when we look at, or when I look at challenges in cities, I always group them into three kind of baskets. There's the basket of the technological challenge, so the solutions, and I think that for most problems, technological solutions are already out there, maybe not at the scale that we need them to be, but the technical challenge or the technical response to a particular challenge is probably the easier one. Yeah, we get easily lost into all the bells and whistles which can provide us technological solutions, but the technical solutions in principle, I think they're out there. When it comes down to financing, I think also there's a lot of money out there. I'm not to worry. Of course, it might seem very challenging, but particularly cities which have their house in order, who know what they want, I think they will be very successful in attracting additional private sector financing or financing from other sources. So again, I don't think financing, so the second basket of issue, is really that difficult to address. Not easy, but it's not that difficult. The key is, of course, the third basket, which is the institutional challenges. I think Pravina also referred to that earlier when it comes down to e-vehicles introduction. It's the legal environment. It's the getting people to work together. It's the breaking down barriers, etc., etc. So this is really where the key challenge is. So looking at these three areas of challenges: technological, financial, and institutional, is definitely the institutional, which we, in our experience, is the key bottleneck. Yeah.
Great. So technology exists, and then money is not hard to find, but it's that institutional environment, legal frameworks, etc. On the money, it's could you comment on how this might be different for the money to pay for those smart city solutions within the cities versus the money to fund the development, the R&D? Pavina mentioned a lot of R&D in her presentation. Are startups also able to find the money easily, in your opinion? And I'll come to Pavina after for her opinion.
Yeah, I'm not working for startups, but I think if you have good ideas, so ADB itself, we have an entity called ADB Ventures, in which we invest in early startups, which really are promising, which is another indication that I think, if you have a good idea, that, finding resources for that. The key challenge, however, for cities and having these really enthusiastic startups is that no city really wants to depend too much on one particular service provider. Yeah. Let's say, we choose to go with solution X. Mayor will change, budget will change. Normally, a company X will still need to provide after-sales services, updates, etc., etc. This goes very quick. Of course, once the mayor is different, maybe he will say, this is, previous project from the previous mayor. So it becomes very challenging. So this is one, I think, one of the key challenges we have to look at is we have so many great ideas, but we, even as ADB, we can't be seen as being partial and push one particular solution, one particular service provider. So it's really how do you match that demand and supply without being unfair to others, and so it's I think that's really a challenge for us.
Yeah. Pavina, what do you think? Is the money there? If you have a good idea, does the money come? And are those other technology aspects of solutions, are they relatively easy to address or quite mature at this point? You did make it sound simple, intuitive, your solution. Is it easy? And again, money, is it easy to come by?
That's a really good question, Janet. I think there are two challenges from really the startup ecosystem perspective. One is if you look at kind of the startup life cycle diagram, right, where you look at ideation to technology deployment to the valley of death, when startups are really burnt. They've got a prototype already available, but they don't have a addressable market, or they don't have pilots in place, and they're burning through a lot of cash and need to fundraise quite quickly. So that's kind of the valley of death that most technologists or entrepreneurs like to refer to. I think that what we're seeing in the broader ASEAN Asia Pacific ecosystem is, one, in the early stages at pre-MVP, pre-minimal viable product and pre-prototype, when you're just in the ideation phase, it's quite challenging to find capital, because a lot of the venture capital funding that are available typically goes towards entrepreneurs that already have a prototype in place and have some sort of revenue or some sort of traction. Now, it's very different from the ecosystem in the US, where venture capital investors are used to investing based on an idea, a pitch deck, or rather than having a technology already deployed. Where we're seeing the public sector add value here is really through providing non-dilutive funding, which is grant funding that can help de-risk that process, right? And we're seeing some of that being deployed in the Australian market. From my perspective, we haven't been able to find similar solution within the broader ASEAN context, but I'm curious to hear your view on that. So that's the challenge at the early stage, is being able to find funding to build towards an MVP, get your idea to an MVP stage. Now, the second challenge, what we've found is that most startups fail in kind of that phase, which is called the valley of death, because they're not able to find the market to commercialize their technology. They have the technology available, but if you're a B2B platform and you're in a sector that is regulatory heavy, like the energy sector, it becomes quite challenging in trying to find your first early adopters or customers that will be paying for your product. So I think that's the challenge really, is that being able to find that early customers to buy your product from a B2B perspective. So I think that's where the role of policy and city governments can come in to really de-risk some of that process. So engaging the public sector early on in part of the product design process, so that they're part of the process, either through coming on board as the early adopters of the technology, or as an investor potentially, either through grant or equity funding. That could be one element as well. But I think from my perspective, there's a lot of role the public sector can play in trying to de-risk this technology. Because ultimately, if you look at waste management, and as an example, looking at waste management technologies for the Indonesian market, a lot of times you do have to work with local regulators or local entities, I've looked in a waste management project and where we were looking at advising state government entity on how to effectively manage their waste across a number of islands. So I think as a startup, being able to get in front of the right organizations and get that first pilot agreement in place can be a challenge if you're in the early stages. And I think a program that is designed to match startups with B2B customers can be quite helpful to help them scale their technology and create a market for their technology.
Yeah, and what you're saying about partnerships and the need to have support at those early stages, but maybe even throughout the whole lifespan of a startup, is something that we've been thinking about for the Smart Cities Innovation Lab. And that, especially when it comes to the Valley of Death, I've heard a venture capitalist say he loves investing in startups that have been through the Valley of Death, just to know that they've got what it takes, which seemed a bit cruel at the time. So, okay, with this, yeah. So now we've got the pictures from you both, and your deep experience in this innovation space. What I'd like to do now is present our approach on the Smart Cities Innovation Lab, and then open up some discussion on where we can really lean in our support to enable that ecosystem to develop, those partnerships to build, as well as to support people with solutions and how to get those to cities. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen. And I'd also like to just acknowledge Brian, who's joined us, and will be joining the discussion after the presentation. All right. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to explain our approach, introduce the Smart Cities Innovation Lab from UN-ESCAP, the Economic Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. What we want to do is channel those smart cities solutions, like what Praveen's presented, to the cities in Southeast Asia, maybe beyond Southeast Asia, that are already within our network or that already have smart cities action plans. So we don't want to create anything, reinvent any wheel, but we really want to support what's already there and build on it. What we find important is to bring together development actors, entrepreneurs, and larger private sector companies that can form a bit of that support system for startups, and a bit of that security for cities that are bringing in those solutions. What is in our capability, it's also to draw out those insights where those barriers are, raise awareness through media engagement, and then also bring them into our policy dialogues through the multilateral system. Okay, so we've got a list of issues that we would like to address with this, our solution. Not necessarily bad issues, but the first one is that most of ASEAN's growth is in its cities, and therefore it's a great focus or a lens for digital technology and smart tech to roll up, to scale up. Secondly, those cities are increasingly digital, with ICT infrastructure and digital literacy growing. Joris mentioned that we're responding to COVID. One of those is the increase in digital transactions, moving away from cash or money, sorry, I should say, towards digital transactions, which also already brings us all up to another level of digital literacy. But the third point, which is starting to be a little bit of a problem, is that there are multiple overlapping innovation programs that are addressing smart city solutions, but there's no clear pipeline. So we're seeing incubators, accelerators, venture studios, venture, we mentioned ADB Ventures, for instance, but they are all operating more or less in silos, which involves a lot of duplication of efforts. I know from my past experience in managing innovation programs, a lot of time is spent on sourcing solutions, identifying them, and conducting due diligence. So this would also be quite an interesting point of efficiency if we could all work together and share our due diligence and insights into the solutions that are out there so we can really get them rolled out. The fourth point is that especially within the UN system, but broader in the multilateral system, cooperation with large companies remains untapped. So we're a little bit shy about engaging with one large company or another, lest we appear to be preferencing one. However, this is a time to engage them. They do have the capital and a lot of the capabilities needed to support smart cities rollouts. And more so, they are moving from sort of CSR type sustainability, which is a little bit, more charitable work on sustainability, moving from that to integrating sustainability into their core business strategy. So why not cooperate with them and present to them the vision that we have for sustainability and work together? The fifth area is that a lot of the smart tech discourse is still focused on manufacturing in Southeast Asia. More needs to be done to link smart technology to urban development, especially given the first point, which is that urbanization is really rapidly moving forward. And the last point is that a lot of cities have smart cities action plans, priorities, and they've had training, but there are gaps and barriers on the supply side. Some are still regulatory. We've also heard that there are real barriers in the procurement processes, or it could be that the supply has not reached secondary and tertiary cities. So let's try to address it.
I'm sorry, Janet. Just
Yes.
want to check if you'll also be sending this PDF out to the rest of the audience, because I seem to only be able to see the top bar of your PDF, and I think some of the other speakers are facing a similar issue as well.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Let me stop the share and start again. How's that?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for mentioning it. So there we go. We've got a smart tech barrier right there. Well, let's continue. So what is the Smart City Innovation Lab? So we've got different elements to the program, but at the core is the lab itself, which invites development agencies and tech companies in Asia to collaborate on supporting entrepreneurs to address those smart cities solutions in Asia. We'll use the lab to showcase smart cities innovations, maybe at different stages of ICT readiness of those cities, as well as Joris mentioned, it doesn't always need to be the highest tech. It can be sort of appropriate technology as well. The second point is to demonstrate what an innovation ecosystem is so that we can all cooperate on smart cities and demonstrate how actors can coordinate their roles. So some UN agencies are great at incubating and others are great at financing. Others are better at getting solutions to the market. We're also going to use this innovation lab as a sort of a guinea pig, so we can find along the way why all these things are not always working so smoothly, and where there are systematic barriers, we can capture those in policy briefs and bring them to intergovernmental fora. We also need a basis for a media campaign to tell the story through the lens of innovation actors. So not just the UN talking, but really giving a voice to the various partners of that innovation ecosystem. So the 4 main actors in the labs will be the local governments. We work directly with local governments in ESCAP on various projects. I have a Smart Cities project myself, looking at digital technology for remote sensing and analysis of plastic pollution in Southeast Asian cities, where we combine remote sensing and AI. So that's been a wonderful experience to support local governments there, but we can do a lot more to bring solutions to them. Development partners, of course, within the UN system and the other multilateral partners, but also international development partners of different countries, those international cooperation agencies of various countries who are also working on smart cities innovation. They'll be invited to share their experiences and also recommend startups who has graduated from your incubator or your accelerator. Can they now move up to the next stage through our program? That would be one way to collaborate. As I mentioned, we'd also work with tech companies. So these are the larger companies whose potential to engage on sustainable development is still untapped within the UN system. They'll be invited to serve as mentors and partners of the startups through their own intrapreneurship programs, or otherwise through their sustainability strategies. And lastly, those startups out there that are developing the solutions, we want to give them an opportunity to pilot their business in one of the cities. Particularly if we have small cities, this could be a good first start for some of the startups out there. Okay, but in addition to the lab, we also want to build a community of practice, so create more space for innovation partners to work together, strengthen foundations through training and webinars in the region, and lastly, by communicating. So really adding to the discourse by shining a light on solutions we see workable. And all this is intended to strengthen the pipeline to meet the issue that we found at the beginning, which is that there is not enough supply, particularly for secondary and tertiary cities, for smart city solutions. So we want to support startups who to move down this pipeline by bringing together different development actors and different innovation stakeholders. So someone might have had a great idea with a UNDP program or the Datathon that Joris mentioned, but maybe then they enter the valley of the valley of death that Pavina mentioned, and they don't make it to early stage. So that maybe they can move with some support to the early stage level, or maybe they are there and they have some technical skills, but the business model wasn't quite working. So can we help them there to get to a late stage? Or maybe we have some at the late stage where they already have some traction, some examples. They have some happy customers, but they're wondering where's the capital to scale up, particularly if they have a bit of hardware in their solution. That's quite tricky, especially in EV or energy. And then lastly, there's the market ready, which is wonderful. They can stand, they can compete in the market, but maybe there are a few barriers to really roll out at scale, such as procurement or partnership rules with different cities in Southeast Asia. Just a little bit about our timeline. This month is Urban October, so we get to talk a bit about the Innovation Lab. Then we'll move towards webinars to raise awareness, and then we'll launch with a selection of the cities and startups in March next year. Implementation, and we'll get some time to communicate about it here. So you can contact me for more information or follow the ESCAP social media. And I will pause there. So. Okay. Great. So now I'd like to introduce Brian. Brian Lim, if you can turn your camera on. Brian Lim is from another innovation entity that we think is an important part of the innovation ecosystem. Brian, would you like to introduce yourself and what you've been doing at Rainmaking? How does Rainmaking support smart cities innovation?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Brian from Rainmaking. I'm currently the country manager of the Japan office in Rainmaking. And essentially what we do at Rainmaking, we do two big things. One is really helping startups grow, and that's through our accelerator programs such as Startup Bootcamp. And the other big part of what we do is actually what we call venture building. And we are currently doing this in the UK, Copenhagen, Singapore, and other parts of the world as well. And in terms of smart cities, it's really interesting what Pavina brought up earlier, because in Osaka, what we are doing, and as you can see on my top right-hand corner here, we are running the Startup Bootcamp Scale Osaka program. And what that means is we are helping mature Series A plus startups land into Japan by running pilots or proof of concepts. So instead of using, as Pavina mentioned, funding to fund your growth or expansion in a new market, we are actively searching for the right startups to partner up with the corporates we have in the program to run these proof of concepts or pilots in the smart city space.
So what's in it for those large corporates to work with small startups? Why do they get involved?
Yeah, there are a few reasons actually, Janet. So I think for the large corporates, so the corporates that we have in Osaka, they are very passionate about the entire Kansai region. So they want to see the entire startup ecosystem there grow. And as more business grows, it's also good for them in the long run. Besides that, what they really see as well is potential commercial benefits. By working with a startup, they could essentially look at piloting a new solution, which would then lead to potentially a new revenue stream, or help them save some cost by running such proof of concepts as well, and ultimately help another company grow alongside them. And basically, I think you mentioned this earlier as well, Janet, it's almost like a win-win when the ecosystem grows together.
That's great. So how do then the startup and the large company, they find each other through third parties, like Rainmaking, but then how do you interact with the cities where you're rolling out those solutions? Do you engage the governments at the city or state or national level?
Absolutely. For certain proof of concepts or pilots, you cannot run away from not engaging with the city government or the municipality and so on as well. So we do that. In terms of Rainmaking, the role we play essentially is to search for the right startup partners, to then introduce to the corporate partners. And the additional thing that we do there is actually we help to design these proof of concepts or pilots as well. We don't just throw the startup and the corporate into a room and hope for the best. We don't believe in that. We also don't believe in purely, hoping that magic happens in the room, right? So what we actually do there is we provide I would say a structured approach in terms of the proof of concept design. And then we really help to see through that initial proof of concept with the hope that that eventually ends up in a long-term commercial arrangement between the corporate and the startup.
Yeah. Now, you said you help them develop that concept. Do you get a description of what is required by the city from the city, and how do you engage them or liaise with them specifically? Which departments? How does it work?
Yeah, as always, we would usually what we would do is we would do what we call a scoping session, just to understand some of the key problem areas that the city is facing or the respective corporate partners are facing. But from that big team, right? For example, air quality monitoring. We then need to deep dive a bit further into why they are interested in air quality monitoring in terms of what are the KPIs that then make sense and which startups would be most suitable to partner with the corporate as well as the city to achieve those goals. So obviously we will start with kind of like a high level team, but as we dive deeper and deeper, it helps us design the proof of concept as well, because the startup almost always wants a corporate partner who would then help them enter the Japan market, whereas the corporate partner is looking for a solution that is kind of like has been battle tested and is ready to expand in the new market as well.
And so who ends up investing, who ends up paying for the solution and investing in what's needed to deliver it?
Yeah, so actually the corporate partners themselves end up paying for what we would call a POC fee or pilot fee. And this is because, as we all know, startups are not businesses that work for free.
Oh, it is frozen on my side. Brian, is it frozen for others in the chat?
Yeah.
Ah, that's unfortunate. Brian, I'm sure you're going to jump back on as soon as I move on. But I just want to ask Pavina. Pavina, you mentioned earlier that it might be easier to work alongside an energy company. So not necessarily private sector, could be a public sector company. But who would broker such relationships? I mean, is it easy for a startup to knock on a door and say, we'd like to test some things, we'd like to develop something in a mini grid with you? Or do you need intermediaries, either like consultancies like Rainmaking, or maybe public sector like ADB or the UN? How does it work?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Janet. I think what I've found and really mostly broadly working in the Australian market and looking at examples from the US and European markets is that a lot of startups, I think, find it challenging, obviously, to get the first use case with the utility, just because of the scale and where they are, the scale of the startup itself, to be able to serve a larger utility, right, a larger customer base, but also to where they're at in their technology roadmap, which is really usually in the early stages when they're still trying to achieve proof of concept for their technology, right? And the challenge from the buy side is really looking at, well, as a utility or a customer, I'm not able to deploy this technology unless I know that it absolutely works. Otherwise, I'm not able to roll it out to my larger energy consumer base. So I think there's been a couple of venture studios, and I think Brian alluded to that, around setting up venture studios to match startups with corporate customers on the energy utility side. But I think where the gap is in the ecosystem in the ASEAN market is really being able to match startups with energy utilities, right? And private public sector customers like an EGAT or a PLN or EVN. So how can we bridge that gap? I think that's definitely a role of a public sector and multilateral institution like the UN or potentially the ADB, and where the World Bank could play a role in trying to bridge that gap and get some of these energy utilities involved in the innovation process, right, early on. And one is really to help them understand what the risks are in deploying the technology. And two, I think it allows the startup to gain a good understanding of what the customer's decision-making or business life cycle could look like, to be able to integrate your startup with the customer's decision-making process, right? Because the biggest challenge is really looking at procurement. A lot of times startups end up designing the technology in a silo, not taking into account what the procurement process is on the customer side. And that's usually probably much shorter for a private sector utility. But when you look at the public sector entity, I think you need to be able to get insight into what their procurement cycle could look like if you're looking and trying to deploy your technology, and you really need that pilot to be able to fundraise, right? It can become a challenge if you need to wait a year to be able to even bid for a contract. So I think looking at how can you streamline public sector procurement process to allow startups to test their technology, maybe outside of the standard procurement process, could be quite helpful in unlocking technology advancements and capital in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And some countries we've seen, like Finland, have actually made it mandatory to include a minimum, I believe it's 5% of procurement must be in the innovation space. So I think procurement can play a big role in not only not being a barrier to innovation, but even taking public sector procurement as an opportunity to absorb some of the risk of being an early adopter, early customer to solutions, and working with startups before they roll out. Now we've reached time. Just any final thought from Joris before we jump off, and then we will close the session.
Yeah, thanks so much, Janet. It's really interesting to hear, of course, how Marco and Pavina coming and yourself coming from different directions, offering great ideas to cities. How can we ensure that these cities are indeed receptive to these solutions, and how can we indeed help them to finance and get excited about these solutions? That's a key challenge. So that matchmaking, I very much appreciate the role you guys play in that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joris. So with that, I'd like to just sum up by saying that what we're trying to do in the multilateral space is not reinvent the wheel, but really find where those institutional barriers are and how a multilateral partner can support some of the matchmaking, and also highlight some of the barriers that need to be addressed through longer term policy processes. And we'd also like to bring together actors so that they can work together and make each other's lives a little bit easier so we can move faster. So with that, I would like to thank you very much, Joris and Pavina, and Brian, although we lost him. Smart Tech is still, you say the technology is there, but still we've lost a couple of speakers through it today. But anyway, I'd like to thank you for sharing your insights, and invite you to join us as we move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janet.
Thank you for doing this,
Thank
Janet.
you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Great. Okay, so that's it for our session. And I think we are ready to end the live stream, and like to thank